Dawn broke over the gray, trembling waters of the English Channel on June 6, 1944. The wind carried the scent of oil, salt, and iron. Thousands of ships rolled under a pale horizon, their decks bristling with men who stared into the mist toward a continent held hostage by tyranny. At 5:20, the first shell screamed toward the French coast. The sea erupted in flame. Yet beneath the thunder of the guns, one man's forbidden idea, quietly set in motion months earlier, was about to decide whether the largest invasion in human history would end in triumph or catastrophe. U.S. Navy log, June 6, 1944. The Allies called Operation Overlord, a plan so vast it strained the limits of human coordination. 156,000 men, 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft. Every rivet, every ration, every prayer depended on timing, deception, and luck. Officially, the strategy followed General Dwight D. Eisenhower's approved blueprint. Unofficially, one of his subordinates had broken the rules. He had done something considered reckless, even insubordinate. But as the landing craft surged toward Normandy, his disobedience would begin to reveal its strange, decisive genius. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force Report, 1944. For months, intelligence had warned of disaster. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had fortified France with 6.5 million mines, 12,000 coastal guns, and 58 divisions under the Atlantic Wall. Every Allied planner knew the statistics. If the Germans guessed a landing site correctly, the invasion could fail within hours. The beaches of Normandy were narrow, the tides treacherous, and the inland roads easy to choke with fire. Yet one Allied commander, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, had grown increasingly convinced that sticking strictly to doctrine would doom them. War Department Memorandum, May 1944. Bradley's instincts came from the meat grinder of North Africa and Sicily, where he had seen theory buckle under chaos. He believed that the rigid synchronization demanded by planners in London could not survive first contact with weather, enemy resistance, and the confusion of landing. The invasion, he argued, needed flexibility, localized command, on-the-fly adaptation, and decentralized initiative. But this was heresy in an operation so massive it depended on centralized control. Eisenhower's staff wanted predictability. Bradley wanted controlled chaos. U.S. Army Field Command Notes, 1943. The forbidden strategy, as some of the subordinates called it in whispers, was simple but radical. Empower the men already on the beaches to make real-time tactical decisions without waiting for orders from the ships or headquarters. Every conventional command structure forbade it. Radios were unreliable. Fog and smoke would make coordination nearly impossible. But Bradley insisted that survival depended on giving freedom to sergeants and lieutenants, trusting them to improvise. War, he later wrote, is not geometry. It's the art of recovery. Bradley Papers, Volume 2, 1951. By May 1944, Bradley quietly began embedding this philosophy into training without explicit authorization. At Slapdon Sands and the mock landings along England's southern coast, his teams practiced commanderless scenarios. What to do if leaders were killed, if radios went silent, if confusion reigned. Soldiers learned to navigate by landmarks, improvise demolitions, and self-organize under fire. It looked like disobedience, but in truth, Bradley was teaching survival. Combined Operations Training Report, April 1944. As dawn light touched the coast of Normandy, that forbidden doctrine was about to be tested under fire. At 6:31, the ramps dropped at Omaha Beach. Immediately, machine gun tracers stitched the surf. Entire squads were torn apart before taking a single step. Officers were gunned down within seconds. Communications broke down entirely. The pre-planned signals vanished in static. According to the official plan, this was the moment the invasion should have stalled. But something unexpected happened. The surviving soldiers, men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, didn't freeze. They adapted. They crawled, climbed, and charged through smoke and death, taking command on their own initiative. After Action Report, Omaha Sector, June 1944. Small groups found alternate routes through minefields. Combat engineers, acting without orders, cleared paths using Bangalore torpedoes fashioned from wreckage. Radio operators rerouted signals through destroyed vehicles to relay positions manually. NCOs took over companies. Every deviation from doctrine broke regulations, yet every act of defiance saved lives. By 8:30, some sections of the beach were still under murderous fire, but others had begun to move inland. It was chaos, but organized chaos, precisely as Bradley had envisioned. U.S. Army Combat Engineer records, June 1944. Across the water, Eisenhower's operations board stared in disbelief at the incoming reports. Initial radio silence made it seem as though Omaha had been annihilated. Then messages began filtering in, fragmented, desperate, but unmistakably forward. Where through the wire, one transmission crackled. Request ammo and reinforcements. Another, barely audible through static. We are moving. What headquarters didn't yet realize was that they weren't following orders. They were inventing them. Signal Corps transcript, 6:57 to 8:49, June 6, 1944. German commanders, meanwhile, were equally confused. Field reports from the 352nd Infantry Division described uncoordinated but relentless Allied movements. Small units attacking from impossible angles, seemingly without central direction. To Rommel's staff, it appeared suicidal, but their firepower advantage dissolved when faced with unpredictable, decentralized enemy behavior. German doctrine depended on reading patterns. Bradley's system created none. They come like water, one captured German officer recalled later. We strike, and they reform elsewhere. Bundesarchiv, interrogation report, July 1944. By late morning, the beachhead was still fragile. The tide had risen, washing away equipment. Medics dragged wounded men through red surf while naval shells crashed overhead. But despite the horror, a strange rhythm had emerged. Groups were linking up, marking clear paths, using colored smoke grenades to signal progress. No one was waiting for higher command. They were acting on instinct honed by Bradley's forbidden drills. U.S. Medical Corps log, June 1944. At 9:30, Bradley received word aboard the command ship Augusta that elements of the 16th Regiment had breached the coastal bluffs. He ordered reinforcements to exploit the breach, but stayed remarkably calm. He knew the truth. The victory on Omaha wouldn't come from headquarters. It was already being won by men who had learned to think for themselves. They made a decision. One aide later noted that headquarters was waiting to approve. Operational diary, USS Augusta, June 6, 1944. By midday, with the bluff secured, the German defenses began to fracture. Artillery pieces were overrun by squads that no longer had officers, only determination. The once theoretical initiative doctrine had become living proof that discipline and autonomy could coexist. It was not neat. It was not elegant. But it worked. Army Infantry Assessment, June 1944. Back in London, staff officers would later debate whether Bradley's approach was brilliance or luck. But to the men on the beach, it was survival. When everything went wrong, the forbidden plan had given them permission to act. And in war, that permission is power. Allied War Council Debrief, July 1944. As dusk approached, smoke hung thick over Omaha. The dead lay where the tide touched them, but above the cliffs, Allied flags now fluttered. The cost was horrific. Over 2,000 American casualties, but the foothold was secure. The invasion had not failed. Against every grim prediction, it had succeeded, yet few understood why. On paper, the operation had gone off plan. In practice, it followed a different logic, one born not in command rooms, but in the hearts of soldiers given freedom to fight their way out of hell. U.S. Strategic Analysis Group, 1945. The official reports would take weeks to reconcile, the statistics months to compile. But that night, as Eisenhower walked the corridors of Southwick House, he paused at Bradley's name on the roster and said quietly, he took a risk and it worked. Personal memoir, Crusade in Europe, 1948. Yet what no one outside that room knew was that Bradley's forbidden doctrine was only the beginning. Behind the beachheads, in the days to come, the real test would begin. Whether his radical flexibility could sustain itself under the crushing weight of German counterattack. 3 days after the invasion began, The skies above Normandy were heavy with exhaust and ash. The beaches were secured, but the battle for Breakout had begun. Tanks crawled inland through hedgerows, so thick they seemed designed by nature to stop an army. Bradley's decentralized command philosophy, tested in blood at Omaha, was about to collide with another wall of steel and mud. But within that chaos, his forbidden system hid an unspoken advantage, an invisible network of coordination that no enemy analyst could yet explain. U.S. Army Operations Journal, June 1944. The secret wasn't only human initiative, it was technological trust. Before D-Day, while higher command focused on deception operations like Fortitude and Glimmer, Bradley had quietly championed the mass integration of a then-nascent battlefield communication system, compact FM radios. They were smaller, clearer, and more resistant to interference than traditional AM sets, allowing squads and tanks to coordinate without long-range command. Officially, deployment of the new SCR 300 and SCR 536 radios was limited to reconnaissance units. Unofficially, Bradley's staff ensured they reached every beach assault company. Signal Corps Technical Bulletin 1944. Each set weighed roughly 32 pounds with 15-mile range for line-of-sight transmission. They ran on dry cell batteries and could be operated by a single man under fire. To modern ears, that sounds trivial, but in 1944, it was revolutionary. Previous field radios had crackled with static, breaking down amid artillery shock waves. The FM signal, however, cut through interference like a knife through fog. A corporal behind a hedgerow could now talk directly to a tank crew or coordinate mortar fire without higher authorization. It was a foundation of battlefield decentralization, an idea decades ahead of its time. Technical Manual TM-11 to 242, 1944. The Germans noticed almost immediately. Their intercept units at Caen and St. Lo were baffled by the Allied chatter. They could hear fragments, but the signal clarity and brevity rendered traditional code breaking useless. "They are everywhere and nowhere," wrote a German signals officer in his log. Orders come not from headquarters, but from the field itself. Bundesarchiv, Signal Report, June 9, 1944. Bradley's doctrine meshed perfectly with this new technology. Where Eisenhower's staff sought centralized perfection, Bradley's men thrived on real-time improvisation. In essence, the Allies had stumbled into what modern strategists call a network swarm, distributed command nodes reacting faster than any linear chain of command could match. The Germans, operating on rigid hierarchy and delayed orders, simply couldn't keep up. U.S. Strategic Studies Group, 1945. But radios alone couldn't win Normandy. They needed armor, and that brought another innovation. The M4 Sherman duplex drive tank, or DD. Amphibious, adaptable, and derided by purists, these odd-looking tanks carried canvas flotation screens and propellers, allowing them to swim from landing craft to shore. Many sank in the rough surf off Omaha, but enough made it through a gold Juno and soared to provide crucial early fire support. Bradley's engineers had fought bitterly to keep the DD program alive despite skepticism from British command. He saw it as a physical embodiment of his doctrine, machines that could operate independently in chaos. Bureau of Ordnance Report, 1944. Each DD Sherman weighed about 30 tons and mounted a 75mm M3 gun with a maximum effective range of 2,300 yards. Armor thickness varied from 38 to 76 millimeters, vulnerable against German 88mm cannons, but deadly against light positions. The key wasn't superiority, it was adaptability. The crews, trained under Bradley's flexible initiative doctrine, learned to repurpose their tanks as mobile artillery or command hubs once ashore. A few even used their radios to coordinate infantry advances directly, cutting through bureaucratic layers entirely. Tank Crew Debrief, June 1944. The decisive moment came on June 10th, near the village of Isigny-sur-Mer. German forces had regrouped, deploying elements of the 352nd and 30th Mobile Brigades to cut off the Allied corridor between Omaha and Utah beaches. Visibility was poor. Roads were choked with mud and wreckage. According to standing orders, Allied armor should have waited for full infantry coordination. Bradley's field commanders did not wait. Using the FM network, they orchestrated a multi-directional advance, a maneuver never approved on paper, but executed flawlessly in real time. Operations log, V Corps, June 1944. Radio operators relayed enemy positions directly to tank commanders, who then shifted fire without awaiting artillery clearance. A single message, transmitted in under 10 seconds, could redirect a column of Shermans to flank a machine gun nest hidden in an orchard. Within 30 minutes, the German counterattack had collapsed. Post-battle analysis revealed that the enemy had been outmaneuvered not by superior firepower, but by reaction speed. Bradley's command web had effectively turned chaos into communication. After-action analysis, Isigny, June 1944. German reports captured after the battle read, like testimonies of disbelief. The Americans attack in fragments, yet they move as one, wrote a surviving officer. When we silence one position, another appears, as if guided by invisible hands. Bundesarchiv, Combat Diary, June 1944. Behind these invisible hands stood an unheralded group of innovators, engineers, factory workers, and code technicians. The Motorola Corporation, then a modest electronics manufacturer, had produced over 50,000 portable radios by spring 1944, each tested under simulated artillery shock. Their chief engineer, Donald Mitchell, personally oversaw field adaptations that allowed antennas to survive seawater exposure. Meanwhile, Detroit's Chrysler Arsenal streamlined Sherman production with interchangeable parts, reducing repair time in the field from days to hours. These technical revolutions made Bradley's flexible tactics physically possible. War Production Board Records, 1944. The philosophy spread quickly beyond his immediate command. At Utah Beach, Major General J. Lawton Collins adopted similar autonomy principles. At Gold and Juneau, British and Canadian units began using ad hoc radio networks to coordinate armor with air cover, something previously restricted to corps-level command. The battlefield was evolving in real time, shaped by men willing to break from the orthodoxy of wait for orders. Allied command reports, June 1944. The Germans responded with countermeasures. They jammed frequencies, shelled relay trucks, even infiltrated radio channels with false orders. But Allied soldiers had been trained under Bradley's philosophy to verify through context and instinct, not blind obedience. If an order sounds wrong, find the right one. One training manual read, Training Circular Number 32, 1944. The subtle cultural shift, empowering soldiers to question, to think, was something the Wehrmacht system, rooted in absolute hierarchy, could not replicate. The next critical engagement, Corentin, June 12th to 13th, proved how far the doctrine could go. Paratroopers of the 101st Airborne, isolated after their drop, used portable radios to coordinate with advancing armor units from the beaches. Together, they executed a pincer maneuver on the German 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment. The coordination occurred without written orders or formal approval. It emerged spontaneously from the field. The capture of Corentin linked the beachheads, transforming 5 isolated landings into a unified front. U.S. Army Airborne Division Report, June 1944. Even Bradley's critics could no longer deny the results. Eisenhower's chief of staff, Walter Bedell Smith, later admitted that what had seemed reckless decentralization turned out to be the purest form of modern command. Post-war interview, 1946. Bradley himself remained characteristically humble. It wasn't theory, he said. It was necessity. The enemy gave us no time to think. So we stopped thinking and started deciding. Bradley Memoir, 1951. But the most striking proof came from the enemy's own analysis. Weeks after D-Day, a captured German intelligence report concluded that Allied coordination must rely on an unbreakable radio command line, extending from the highest level to the lowest. They were wrong, but the illusion worked. In truth, the Allied system had no single line, no single center. It was a web, resilient because it could not break in one place. German Army Intelligence Summary Number 78, June 1944. By the end of June, the Allies had landed over 850,000 men and 150,000 vehicles in Normandy. The momentum was irreversible. Yet inside Bradley's mind, the forbidden idea had already evolved into something greater. He saw the battlefield not as a hierarchy, but as an organism, fluid, responsive, self-correcting. It was an insight that would echo across generations of military theory. Strategic Review Panel, 1945. Still, the war was far from over. Ahead lay the hedgerows of St. Lo, the breakout toward Avranches, and the slow, grinding push into the heart of France. The same freedom that had saved Omaha would soon test the limits of control. Because when every man could decide, the line between genius and disaster grows perilously thin. By July 1944, the hedgerows of Normandy had turned into graveyards of ambition. Every field, every dirt road was soaked in rain and diesel, the air thick with cordite and the dull echo of artillery. Operation Cobra, the breakout from the Bocage, was about to begin. Omar Bradley's forbidden doctrine had already rewritten the rules of invasion. Now, its true test would decide the fate of the Western Front. U.S. Army Operations Report, July 1944. The plan was daring. Use concentrated aerial bombardment to rip a hole in the German lines west of St. Lo, then unleash mobile columns through the breach before the enemy could react. But plans in war are only paper until the first bomb drops. Bradley's philosophy of autonomy, the principle of action over authorization, had to prove that a scattered, radio-connected army could operate as one mind under chaos. Allied Supreme Headquarters Directive, July 1944. On July 25th, 3,000 bombers darkened the sky. Waves of B-17s and B-24s unleashed over 4,000 tons of explosives, obliterating the front, but also accidentally striking American lines. Dust clouds blotted out the sun. Men were thrown from foxholes by concussion alone. In that moment of confusion, traditional command would have frozen, but not Bradley's. The decentralized radio web came alive. Surviving platoon leaders used their SCR-300s to rally dispersed units, realigning coordinates and identifying friendly zones within minutes. What might have been a fatal collapse became a controlled chaos, an orchestra of decisions made without a conductor. U.S. Army Air-Ground Coordination Report, 1944. By 1100 hours, the 9th and 30th Infantry Divisions surged forward, punching through gaps created by the bombers. German defenders of the Panzer Division, once elite, found themselves paralyzed by broken communication lines and contradictory orders. Their field phones were cut, runners killed, and headquarters too rigid to improvise. Bradley's men, meanwhile, used short-coded bursts, Fox Red, Advance West, Sherman Line Clear, to maneuver like a living organism. In less than 24 hours, German cohesion disintegrated. Bundesarchiv, Panzer Debrief, 1944. It was a triumph of speed over structure. Engineers like Donald Mitchell, who had refined the SCR-300, could never have imagined their device would decide the course of a continental campaign. Yet, from tank turrets to muddy trenches, it became the pulse of an army. Every message transmitted was a heartbeat, keeping the invasion alive. Signal Corps Field Journal, July 1944. By July 30th, the American front had advanced 25 miles, an astonishing feat through terrain once thought impassable. Eisenhower watched in awe as Bradley's divisions moved faster than German intelligence could report. He later remarked, "It was war at lightning pace." A command system born on the beaches now ruled the roads of France. Supreme Headquarters Memo, 1945. For the Germans, the psychological impact was devastating. Interrogations after the war revealed disbelief and frustration. One captured Panzer officer described it as fighting smoke, solid for a moment, gone the next. Another added, "Their command structure seems fluid like mercury. We cannot strike its center because it has none." U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Psychological Warfare Section, 1946. That was Bradley's forbidden truth. The center of his system was everywhere, and nowhere, initiative had become the new doctrine. The very trait once punished by bureaucracy, acting without orders, was now rewarded by results. U.S. Army Doctrine Analysis, 1947. The ripple effects reached beyond Normandy. In the months that followed, the Allies advanced across France with unprecedented coordination. Fuel convoys moved in synchronized waves. Directed by field transmissions rather than centralized scheduling, engineers built and repaired bridges under fire, guided by live radio feedback from approaching armor. Even medics used portable sets to locate wounded soldiers amid artillery storms. Logistics, communication, and morale had fused into a single living network. Quartermaster Corps Bulletin, August 1944. But the human cost remained immense. Thousands had died in the crucible of Normandy, many under the very system that granted freedom to act. Autonomy demanded sacrifice. Every mistake was one man's to own. Yet within those scars lay the seed of modern warfare. The concept of mission command, formally codified decades later, traced its lineage directly to Bradley's experiment in Normandy. U.S. Army Field Manual 1950. When Allied forces liberated Paris on August 25, 1944, the world saw tanks and flags, but few understood the invisible architecture beneath. Each street advance, each armored thrust, had been guided by unseen voices echoing through radio static. The victory was as much technological as tactical. The Allies had conquered not just territory, but time itself, compressing decision-making from hours to seconds. French Liberation Archives, 1944. After the war, analysts struggled to categorize what Bradley had done. Some called it intuition, others organized chaos. But historians later recognized it as the birth of the network battlefield. Modern militaries would spend decades formalizing what Bradley's men had improvised in the mud of Normandy. Defense Analysis Group Report, 1953. The influence spread beyond war. The principles of decentralized decision-making and adaptive control seeped into Cold War strategy, air defense systems, and eventually digital communication networks. In a way, the modern Internet, built on distributed nodes and fault-tolerant design, reflected the same concept that once guided infantry through hedgerows under fire. Rand Corporation Systems Study, 1962. Bradley never sought fame for it. He often deflected credit toward his soldiers, calling them the smartest men ever to carry rifles. To him, the lesson was simple. Give men the right tools, the right trust, and they'll find their way through hell. Bradley Interview, 1961. Yet within Allied command, his philosophy left a quiet revolution. The rigid doctrine of hierarchy, centuries old, was permanently broken. Commanders who once measured control by the number of orders issued now learned to measure it by how few were needed. Joint Staff Memo, 1948. In post-war Germany, captured generals studied Allied command systems with a mixture of awe and resentment. One Wehrmacht colonel later told U.S. interrogators, "Your general let his army think for itself. Ours only obeyed." That was the difference. U.S. Army Interrogation Report, 1946. The irony was sharp. Bradley's forbidden idea had begun as a violation of orders, an act of quiet rebellion. By war's end, it became doctrine. His decentralized command model formed the backbone of NATO operations, influencing everything from Korean battlefield radios to Cold War nuclear readiness. The principle of local autonomy under shared intent became the foundation of all modern mission structures. NATO Tactical Communications Brief, 1952. As the decades passed, the beaches of Normandy faded into peace. Grass grew over craters, and rust swallowed the iron teeth of war. Yet somewhere beneath that soil lies the invisible imprint of Bradley's experiment. Signals once pulsing through static, men once deciding without waiting. Memorial Archives, Normandy, 1984. Today's generals study Normandy not only for strategy, but for philosophy. They see that victory did not belong to the biggest guns or the thickest armor. It belonged to those who dared to trust chaos, to let initiative breathe. Military History Review, 1998. When the last survivors of D-Day gathered for their 75th anniversary, one old sergeant, radio in hand, was asked what made the difference. He smiled through tears and said, "Dramatize, we stopped waiting for permission to win." And in those words, the spirit of Bradley's rebellion, his forbidden strategy, echoed across time. Because in the end, it wasn't disobedience that changed the course of history. It was faith, faith in men, in machines, and in the fragile link between them. Faith that, even amid the smoke and ruin of war, the human voice could still be heard through the static.